With that, we're going to go to Shaik, who is the Group Executive International Finance at the most powerful indigenous institution on the ground in South Africa and expanding in DBSA that's really pushed, including on trying to get the greater effectiveness in project preparation facilities. But we know there's many rigidities there, which is why we're happy to have a one-stop shop with the EU coming forward. So Mo, my question for you is, given the great depth of experience you've had on the ground across these fronts, and you're always adapting your strategy to better serve both the public and private sector project development market, can you tell us a bit about what your thesis, sounds academic, but of course it's an implementation plan, on how we really remove the barriers in infrastructure project development, and what do you think are the proven interventions and your thoughts on how to reduce the huge time it takes? I mean, if you look at Infraco and all these projects, how long it takes us to get from project concept to project close.
Is this on? Man, that was quite an introduction. Thank you. A couple of points, I mean, that I would want to share with you. That the first is that infrastructure is fundamentally a long-term play. It's not a short-term, it is not a 6 to 7 year matter. Any power purchase agreement to any construction of a road, from the time it's conceptualized to the time it happens, on average is about 12 to 15 years, and if it starts to produce a return, you're looking at 15 to 20 or 25 years. Now, if you work on the basis that there are elections every 5 years in democratic countries, then you are passing through at least 4 to 5 elections. And that speaks to the risk that Alex has raised, that you are planning a project that will go through many cycles of government. You are lucky if it's within the same party administration, and you are incredibly unlucky if it changes party systems, because politically there is a particular challenge we have in Africa, where every new administration changes what the old administration does, right? And that can affect you in terms of your infrastructure play. And when you conceptualize the projects, you need to think very clearly about that. And this is why the notion of unsolicited bids is increasingly becoming a challenge question in terms of a risk, because it is better that a bid is not unsolicited. It is better that the bid is taken through Parliament. It is better that there is some kind of legal instrument that as investors you can rely on when you need to rely on it in respect of when an infrastructure project is challenged. Ma'am, I think your phone is ringing. The second is that if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. So you've got to have a deep understanding that from conceptualization all the way down to delivery or maintenance and operation, that the risk profile changes. And it changes, and as that risk profile changes, you are going to get new challenges. So those who can make risk alive and understand the different risks that you take in a project, and through the different phases in the project, and if you're able to adapt your instruments to that particular risk, you will succeed. Often when we plan projects, we start from the very beginning, adopting what I call an optimistic approach. And essentially under the optimistic approach, nothing goes wrong. Our experience is that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. And you just need to have the capacity to be able to deal with that challenge when it arises. As a banker, we have a word for that. It's called impairments and reversal of impairments. So in other words, you've got to set aside X amount of capital to impair what you consider to be a good deal that goes wrong later. And then once you've corrected it, you'll be able to reverse that impairment. So you need to have teams that are very alive to the risk that you would be taking in a particular country. The third issue I want to raise is that we've got to understand that infrastructure in Africa, and especially we are now talking about large infrastructure. Large infrastructure that the investors look at or banks look at, etc. All infrastructure, to the best of my knowledge, in Africa is owned by an African sovereign. There is very few infrastructure, and I would say that perhaps only in South Africa and a few other countries where there's now an adoption of a partnership model. So African governments can serve themselves incredibly well by spending a lot of energy in building capacities within their governments to understand the new science that is emerging in infrastructure. Infrastructure is no longer just the absence of things. So if it's just the absence of things, you just build things. Infrastructure is at the core of a country's development plan. It is the core of the country's economic growth vision. And if they spend building the capacities to understand infrastructure, because it is immensely complicated. And often when we are dealing with utilities, we see this lack of capacity, and very often we are more than willing to get lenders' technical advisors or lenders' technical assistants to be able to capacitate utilities or sovereigns in the main to understand the complexities of the financial models, to understand the complexities of the legal issues. And we find that that capacity, if a government wants to develop an infrastructure, they should be willing to spend that kind of money or get that kind of assistance from Roberto, from the EU or other places to build infrastructure capacities within government to understand the complex nature of infrastructure. I would make one last point. And the last point is that as investors, we also got to understand that infrastructure is subsidized. And that is a really difficult issue to comprehend. It is only in the ICT world where the private sector can invest and get a return commensurate to that investment, where the return is greater than the cost of the capital. So we could understand why ICT is driven by the private sector. But if you take energy, and here's the biggest conundrum we have in the energy play, that the more amount of money coming into energy, well, someone is subsidizing it, because often when we analyze what is the cost of the energy that the utilities are passing on, especially to residentials, we find that there is a subsidy. So at some point in time, we have to have a debate about the true cost of tariff and how do you reflect cost of tariff into the emerging middle class in Africa. And this is not to say that we shouldn't have a scaled way or a way of giving X amount of power free, but unless you have cost-reflective tariffs, you're going to have challenges. Transport is subsidized. I think in South Africa, we attempted a tolling system, and because, again, of the complexities of infrastructure, we dealt only with the supply side, and we didn't look at the demand side. And the demand side is hashtag tolls must fall. So when hashtag tolls must fall came out, we have a great tolling system in the Gauteng road complex, but the middle class is not willing to pay for those tolls. So in some way, it is getting back to the government fiscus, which adds the kind of debt. But yet, if you want to invest in tolls, if you want to invest in road infrastructure, well, where does that money come from? So I would leave you with this. The challenge in infrastructure in Africa is to find bankable projects in relatively unbankable countries which has essentially unbankable utilities. And the challenge of that is left to clever people on that side of the room, and often we leverage that kind of thinking to make bankable projects in essentially unbankable utilities, and that is a challenge that we have.
We have to keep, this is brilliant again, capturing the issues. But the technical and the trust divide, of course, between public and private sector, because somehow, as many of us know in the project development space, there's the assumption that somehow we can get cost recovery on a tariff in a deal when we don't do it in the developed world, because energy is subsidized, transport is subsidized.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.